Welcome back to EDIT 640. This will be the first content module in our course, and as such, it will be an introduction to the field of instructional video production. We will begin with a review of some of the theoretical foundations supporting instructional video, starting with one of the most infamous quotes in communications history, "The medium is the message." Following that, we'll take a look at several contemporary frameworks of storytelling and look at examples of how modern producers design instructional videos using these frameworks. Then we'll review the many roles that are involved in the production process, and finally, we'll take a look at the fundamental components of the instructional video production workflow. Let's begin with "the medium is the message," a now infamous quote by one of the communication industry's most vanguard thinkers, Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan's books were published in the era, and this is important to understand, when broadcast television was anticipated as this medium that was capable of revolutionizing teaching in schools. In fact, in 1967, the Johnson administration even passed legislation, and this legislation formally recognized the ability of this new technology, broadcast television, to enrich man's spirit, quote. And this laid the foundation for the public broadcasting service that would start a few years later, where educational content, you may not know this, but educational content made up the majority of its program initially. But McLuhan was way ahead of his time, really, and in writing his book, Understanding Media, to explain how TV changed the human mind, he inadvertently launched a frenzy of media comparison studies, where lots and lots of determined researchers explored questions that compared instructional modalities like, does TV teach better than radio, or does TV teach better than face-to-face classroom instruction? McLuhan grew incredibly agitated after the release of his book at being so grossly misinterpreted. What he meant to say in saying the medium is the message was simply that viewing televised content was rapidly changing the way humans process visual information. That was the true message of the medium. It was changing us. This is what he was trying to convey, but everyone misunderstood him. Pop culture and even educational researchers just didn't get it. So a frustrated McLuhan titled his next book with an absolutely outrageous pun and a cover photo that emphasized the effects that this new medium would have over its audience. The medium is the massage, in other words, implying that the medium is physically changing us in the same way that a massage would make us feel differently. So we fast forward a few decades, and we learn from several other leading researchers that McLuhan was actually right. As information modalities have evolved to include more multimedia representations across a wide variety of different tools, learners have necessarily had to adapt to process information differently. One of the leading researchers initially in this decade, in the 80s, was Alan Pavio, and he was the first to present a cohesive dual coding theory that explained how the brain processed visual and verbal information simultaneously, but differently. When we watched information that also had an accompanying verbal soundtrack to it, both channels were operating simultaneously, but the operations were very, very different. And this was very provocative thinking for that decade. And later, another researcher picked up on this notion and continued Pavio's research. Gabriel Solomon expanded on his notion that the idea that cognition was not only happening simultaneously, it was actually a highly distributed process and very similar, not unlike, a computer. He also found, and this was fascinating, he also found and founded an invested mental effort theory. And this theory posited that students perceive it takes less cognitive energy to view than to read. And they make their media selections accordingly. So what do you think they're going to choose? Well, obviously, in their eyes, they choose the path of least resistance, which many times was the visual medium over reading. They didn't think reading or they thought reading was more difficult than actually viewing visual media. And so they would make these choices. And the end result on the educational research for half a decade was a lot of studies that found no significant difference. And it was really puzzling to researchers for a long time, trying to make sense of how this incredibly powerful computing device could combine media from lots of different sources, and yet they were not showing any significant gains in learning. Well, that finally changed with when Richard Mayer and Janet Marino and Ruth Clark and many others started cultivating all these ideas that ultimately evolved into cognitive load theory. And that theory extrapolated that learning with multimedia suddenly became a truly researchable construct. And one of the most important things that came out of cognitive load theory was the suggestion that there was this limited amount of visual and verbal information that learners can process. And more importantly, and this is where Mayer's work has been incredibly influential, how that information is designed and how it's delivered absolutely matters. His book, Multimedia Learning, for example, demonstrates numerous research-validated practices, design practices, specific design strategies to make multimedia display better and result in better retention and better student achievement. These design practices were written to help any educator make better-looking and more effective instructional materials, particularly video. And that's really where we come in. Although instructional video production is rooted heavily in cognitive science and empirical theory, at the end of the day, it really is an artistic form of storytelling. And that's where I want this course to begin. Consider, for example, the classic entertainment model we all know from Hollywood. We begin with a setting. We have characters that are introduced. There's some type of plot where the characters interact. And then somewhere in there toward the end, there's some type of resolution. The point is, in the classic model of storytelling, the plot is centric. Classic storytelling is typically plot-driven. It's a little different on the instructional side, although we have settings and we do have characters, although we don't tend to think of them in the fictional sense always, unless it's a reenactment. And we'll talk a lot more about this in detail. But instead of a plot, typically there is some type of important question that's asked. How do I do something? What's missing? How do I learn this? What do I need to know? And the video then, or the instructional storytelling, presents a solution at some point, typically toward the end of the video. So the key difference then is that but in storytelling, the classic model is plot-driven, and in the instructional model, it's driven around some type of research question. And I want to begin by playing here some examples. I want to play a montage of a few examples from classic cartoons that we all remember. Obviously, film and video, as we know it, would work the same way as far as the classic model is concerned. But I'm going to focus on cartoons, maybe just get a little nostalgic here. But as you watch these, I want you to think about why these stories were so memorable. Because after all, they were incredibly formulaic. There are lots of patterns here, patterns of structure, the way these story elements are composed, and the way they're repeated week after week after week. And it, despite being entirely predictable, they were almost always engaging. Why is that? So let's take a look at a few of these. It'll just be a couple minutes, and then we'll debrief.
I must be dreaming. It couldn't be this easy. Okay, quick, hide in here. Now don't move until I tell you to.
Yes, they wish to join their friends. Very well. Like Barney said, you're the greatest, Kazoo.
Scooby-Dooby-Doo, where are you? We got some work to do now. Scooby-Dooby-Doo, where are you? We need some... excited to meet someone new. There should be friends, cause you see friends. Everyone's welcome with Winnie the Pooh.
Smurfs! You ought to be ashamed, pestering poor Smurfette like that. Now run along. I apologize for their behavior, Smurfette. But if you do decide to marry, you might consider an older, more mature Smurf of the world.
Well, I worked at the Krusty Krab, frying up patties and blabbity blah. Huh? That's new. Strange place to park a car. What's this for?
SpongeBob, you're wasting me precious carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide?
I'm pumping it into the atmosphere, boy. Thanks to global warming, the temperature will soon go through the roof, and then we'll have an endless summer.
What do you want?
Jillian is very bright, and she happens to be a very talented photographer.
Oh, that is so lame. Every hot girl who can aim a camera thinks she's a photographer. Ooh, you took a black and white picture of a lawn chair and its shadow and developed it at Save On. You must be so brooding and deep.
Knock it off.
Don't do it, Carmen! Well, I'm warning you! Okay. I'm getting pretty sick of him calling my mom. Well, cause I'm the bitch, she's the big fat bitch, she's the biggest bitch in the whole wide world. She's a stupid bitch, and everyone's a bitch, she's a bitch too. Well, the boys take care of her.
Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that what makes Hollywood stories so engaging, whether it's a cartoon or a blockbuster movie, there's one commonality, and that is the desire to elicit an emotional response from the viewers. That's the hook. We watch these cartoons, they make us laugh, that's an emotional response, we're hooked. Well, with instructional video, it's a little different. In instructional videos, the hook is a solution to a problem. And to be effective, the problem itself has to be engaging. It has to be relevant to the learning needs of the target audience. And this is the context that frames most instructional videos. They're problem-based. And this is what helps distinguish them from, let's say, information videos, from news journalism in particular, where, although I have to admit the line does blur considerably, in fact, many of the techniques we will learn in this course are adapted directly from news video production. But I want you to approach this, and I guess it all boils down to this simple point here. I want you to approach this course from a very simple macro-level context. How can we produce videos that solve instructional problems? It will probably help to start by looking at some examples, and I want to do so within the context of presenting them to you as a set of frameworks. These frameworks are varied, and I want you to keep in mind that these design frameworks are rarely mutually exclusive, and many times you'll actually see producers mix and match depending on what the instructional messages are that they're actually trying to communicate. Let's begin with presentation. And I want you to watch this. We'll watch just a part of this clip here from the Do It Yourself Network.
Adding a tile backsplash to your kitchen or bath is a great way to amp up a room. And between stone, glass, ceramic, porcelain, there are thousands of styles to choose from. Now, if you're new to tiling, working in a small area like a backsplash is a great way to get some experience under your tool belt before you go on and tackle a larger area like a shower stall. When it comes to choosing your tile style, you can pretty much put anything on the wall that you want to. But keep in mind, you want to work with a tile that fits in your space nicely. The less cuts...
Okay, what you should be noticing in this example is how presentation is very direct. The speaker or the host talks typically directly at the camera, and the audio track, the narration coming out of her mouth, is what's really carrying the majority of these instructional messages. There are lots of cutaways, clips that divert away from her and focus on what it is that she's talking about. And these are usually synchronized. And in this way, the captured audio, in other words, what it is she's saying, the captured live audio, becomes a sort of narration track on top of the cutaway footage. And this is important because the audio sounds the same with each cut. In other words, you record the audio at the same time you're shooting the video. You just intersperse it with these different cutaway clips. But because the audio was all recorded in one take, it sounds continuous. And this is really important, and we'll learn a lot more about how to record good field audio later in the course. All right, let's look at the next category, narration. This is another very common framework here. In this case, we don't have a host talking to us. We have this omniscient narrator. This is from the American Heart Association trying to teach us how to do CPR.
The American Heart Association is the nation's leader in life-saving CPR training. In fact, we write the CPR guidelines for everyone, the public, doctors, nurses, and paramedics. This year, we've made a few changes so that it's much easier for anyone to save a life using CPR. Let's take a quick review of the new CPR process and when to use it. When someone's heart stops beating, it's called cardiac arrest. CPR is needed right away when this happens. Cardiac arrest victims will die if they don't get help fast. When cardiac arrest strikes, the victim typically collapses, stops breathing.
Okay, I want you to notice a couple things here. We have an omniscient narrator that's presenting information that's highly scripted, and so the audio is carrying a lot of the instructional messages. But on top of that narrated audio, you also have some background audio here from a recreated fictional situation where you have a heart attack victim going down. Well, this is very typical, but certainly it's not a requirement. Narration can cover many different kinds of footage, including photos, video clips, recreations, interviews, etc. And we'll learn a lot more about this later. But the key point that I want to make here is that this is highly scripted narration, different from what we saw in the presentation video category before. In that example, the audio track was pulled directly from the host's dialogue as it was being recorded in the field. In this example, the narration is recorded in a studio, and then it's laid underneath this other footage, in this case, a recreation. Let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look at demonstrations. And this is something that is familiar to many of us. Obviously, this comes from a cooking show, in this case on the Cooking Channel. And let's take a look at just a few seconds of this.
I'll roast chicken with a mixture of parsley, fennel, and thyme that bursts with an herb flavor, and serve it with a medley of spring vegetables. I make a fresh herb mixture with parsley, thyme, fennel seeds, spicy red pepper flakes, and garlic. Then I stuff it under the skin of the chicken to infuse the flavors into the...
Okay, so far it's just been a narration. I know you're waiting for the demonstration part. Obviously that's going to come up here soon, but at the beginning, and this is a good practice, the narration previews what content the learners will actually view. And then quickly thereafter, the demonstration footage begins.
Meat. I want to start heating up the pan, and we're going to add some olive oil. We're going to take one at a time and basically just gently separate the skin from the meat. And we're going to take a little bit of the herbs and just tuck it in underneath, so between the skin and the flesh of the chicken.
Okay, so what you notice differently in this one, once the actual demonstration part begins, is that we've got real-time captured footage, both audio and video. And although it's highly scripted, there's certainly room for improvisation. After all, you never know when she might drop the chicken, or they might drop a utensil. They may have to retake it. At some point, you have to make decisions about what kind of footage you can keep. And this is so much harder to do than it really looks. But the point is, the visuals here carry a much greater emphasis. They carry a lot more significant amount of the actual instructor and instructional message here. Now, let's move on to the next category here. We're going to look at all of these in much more detail and many examples later in the course, but this is just to introduce some of these frameworks here. Let's look at the dialogic method, and this is from a show about trucks.
This truck is very cool, from the way it sits to the ghost flames. Very cool truck. The only problem with a truck like this, well, it costs a lot to get it around. Because of the cost of diesel fuel, it's put a lot of crunch on people's style, especially yours.
Oh, yeah, a little bit there, no doubt. Hey, the guys at Dino Fuel Alternatives have got the answer for that, though. This is the Veggie Stroke Kit, and basically what it does is you install that in the truck. Now the truck runs on vegetable oil, right? Now you're going to save a lot of money in fuel costs, so that is a good thing.
Now, this whole kit, it comes with everything you need, so much that you'll never have to run down to the parts store, because that can kill your whole weekend. Everything you need is included here. It's also got a very cool option here that you can go with, and what we did is went with this fuel tank. Now, it looks good, so it's going to keep this truck looking good, but it's also very practical, too, because it's completely heated. Let's say you live up north and have to worry about any...
Okay, as you can see here, we're dealing with highly scripted dialogue again, but in this case, we actually have two presenters, and both of them are experts. This is a convention in the field, but certainly there are other methods as well. Sometimes you'll have this dialogic method use an expert paired up with a novice, and the novice is asking lots of questions. Personally, I find that kind of annoying, and I like this type of format much better, where no matter what comes out of the actor's mouth, whether it's the one on the left or the one on the right, they both know a lot, it seems, and it's real easy to extract the information from them. In any event, this as well is very hard to do, especially as an actor or as the subject on the camera. What makes it so difficult, even though it's highly scripted, it's very difficult, and especially with very technical information like this, it's hard to read a script and memorize a script and not sound like you're reading, especially when you're in a dialogue and you're trying to recreate that sense of spontaneity that you get in a real conversation. Nevertheless, we see dialogic frameworks quite often in instructional videos. Now let's look at another one. This is very, very common. Let's look at interviews. And in this particular example, this is going to come from a classic archetype of interview style production, and that is, of course, documentary filmmaking. In this case, this is a documentary about the history of big wave surfing, certainly something that I'm interested in. But what I want you to see here, and I'll go ahead and press play here because it begins with this really long shot here of a very large wave. But what I want you to notice here is how we have this footage interspersed with interview content. And I want you to take a look at how the rhythm of the interview content is set up.
Larry's the king out there. I mean, he was the one that, like Greg at Waimea, dragged the guys out there.
You just watch him surf, and there's no one that comes close to his abilities.
He has the ability to actually slow himself down, where everybody else just wants to run like hell.
The reason why I'm able to ride waves the way I ride waves and do what I do is because I have partners like Dave and Derek. I'm only arriving at this level because I'm being driven by these guys to this level.
Okay, funny story. I almost ran over this guy one time when I was surfing in Hawaii, but I don't have time to tell you about that. Anyway, he's much bigger in person, I'll say, than he looks in the video. Nevertheless, what I want you to notice about this example here, as popular as this technique is, there's a cadence here that you need to pay attention to, a rhythm. And again, we'll look at these lots of examples like this many times over in this course, but I want you to notice this rhythm. We started off with an opening provocative shot. He's riding this big wave. And then we cut away to a tight shot of somebody being interviewed. In that case, Jerry Lopez, another famous surfer. And each one of these successive interviews is sequenced in between shots of Laird Hamilton, who's being profiled in this segment. Interspersed in there, we have these clips of Laird riding these big waves. So there's this cadence, this rhythm. You have footage, then you cut away to an interview dialogue, and then that interview dialogue will J-cut into the next clip. And then we go to another interviewee. And notice how we don't see the same interviewee at all. We have 4 different people that are speaking, including Laird at the very end. And this is all very deliberate. And if I use the term J-cut there and you have no idea what that is, don't worry. You're going to learn that later on in the course. The point is this thematic cycling between these different subjects who are being interviewed helps establish a much more authentic style, which is very common and very desired in the documentary genre. And these stories, in many cases, are actually discovered while the production takes place. In other words, the director and the producer, etc., nobody really knows where this is going. They have a loose set of ideas that they follow, and they document this, and they discover the story as they go. And so it has this very authentic feel to it. Let's switch now and talk about the different types of production roles that typically are required in any type of instructional video production. A lot of these shots here and a lot of these roles are derived from Hollywood-style productions, and the point is not to terrify you. The point is simply to show you that as an instructional videographer, you have to wear so many different hats. You will have to assume all of these roles to some degree. So let's take a look at some of these. Let's begin, of course, with the producer. The producer is the executive decision maker for all necessary components of the production. The stage manager is most importantly in charge of blocking, and that refers to where the actors go, where the props go, where the sets go. The stage manager makes all those decisions and has to do so knowing where the cameras are and where the cameras need to be. And often the stage manager in Hollywood productions anyway does not have input in where the cameras go and is essentially being told where the cameras are and has to adjust the blocking accordingly. Set designers. Of course we need set designers, even if set designing in your context for many of you will simply be scouting out an outdoor facility or an outdoor location, and you may not have to actually fabricate anything, but you will definitely have to choose where that goes. All that is part of set design. In some other cases, you might actually have to make something, or at the very least, you may have to rearrange the furniture in a room, close some drapes, open some drapes, get better lighting, etc. And all of those are responsibilities of the set designer. The field director is the person that we stereotypically think of when we think of a director. That's the person who's on site managing the acting and determining what B-roll footage needs to be captured so that all of this can be integrated later on. The lighting director is exactly what you would think it would be. This is the person who makes the decisions on how to light up an indoor set, or how to use reflectors, or how to maximize sunlight, or how to position the cameras in outdoor shoots. The technical directors are in the field. These are people who manage the cameras, and this is mostly for live multicam productions. And even though we're going to learn some multicam techniques here, for many of us, because it requires additional equipment, it may simply be beyond what we're capable of doing. But nevertheless, the technical director is essential. This is the person who manages the cameras, decides which one needs to be the one that's actually captured, and as well as determining which graphics to use and to time when the graphics come on, to switch between the different cameras, etc. This is the person, for example, that does the scoreboard directing at most football games and basketball games. All that content is queued up and all those cameras are live, and you have a technical director that's switching actively between all of these different feeds. The editor, of course, just like it sounds, this is the person who cuts and composites all the footage and all the media, including audio, making all those important edit decisions. Audio technician, absolutely essential. One of the most important people in the production process, perhaps even more so than directors, if you can believe that. because if you get no audio or your audio is compromised, you have a poor production. Audiences will not tolerate poor audio. They will tolerate scratchy video and shaky video, even though it's not desirable, but they have no tolerance for poor audio. So that's stressful, especially for teachers on a budget who don't have access to high-end equipment. And later on in the audio module for this course, we'll talk about some strategies that you can implement to boost the quality of the audio that you're getting. Graphics designer, again, just what you would think. This is the person that creates all of the titling as well as the images and photos and graphics that will need to be composited by the editor later on. Camera operator controls the cameras, but more importantly and more specifically, and we'll start talking about this next week, they determine how to frame and how to shoot, or more often than not, they have a storyboard in front of them that tells them the kind of shot that the director and the producer want, and they have to frame accordingly. Zoom shots, tight shots, wide shots, dolly shots, so many different kinds of shots and framing techniques, and all of this is delineated in the storyboard, and that's to inform the camera operator so that they get the shot. In live productions, these guys mostly have headsets on, and they're communicating with the technical director who might tell them to make certain changes dynamically. Makeup and costume artists, of course, your subjects or actors need to look their best or look the part, so they will obviously need to be dressed up or made up accordingly. And speaking of actors, in the sense of an instructional production, the term actor can also refer to hosts, to guests, to journalists, we sometimes just call them generically subjects. It can even refer to the extras in the background. So we're just going to use in our course anyway, the term actor and subject interchangeably, even though we tend to think of the Hollywood definition of an actor who's been formally trained. In our class here, if we say actor and subject, we'll simply be referring to them in the same way. You also sometimes hear the term talent. Sometimes it's difficult to manage camera talent. That means whoever's in front of the camera. Reporters, of course, you know what reporters do, and they have a critical role. They have to get the subject to speak, and hopefully to speak articulately, so that the editor doesn't have to struggle trying to stitch together some of the coherent thoughts that might come out of their mouth. Interviewing is definitely a skill that can be learned. We have lots of strategies that we'll study later on in the course about how to get the people you're filming to actually speak intelligibly. Let's talk finally about production workflow for instructional videography projects. Essentially, there are 4 steps: the planning process, the production process, followed by post-production and deployment. For planning, in this particular stage, we write treatments, we design storyboards, we write scripts, we select the sites where we're going to shoot, we build sets if we need them or find the props. We, of course, have to cast actors or find subjects that we're going to interview or use in the production. If we need costumes, those happen well in advance of actual production. Once production starts, obviously, you need a lighting strategy. If you're doing any scripting at all, there needs to be significant rehearsal. You have to check your audio, make sure your audio is working. Obviously, you shoot your content, get your takes, and log your takes. And that's all part of the management process, and we'll look at a lot of different strategies for that. In post-production, you take the footage, import it into the timeline, and edit. You also do your compositing. You add graphics and titles as necessary, and then eventually you export the file into some desired medium for future deployment. Speaking of which, you have lots of different deployment options. You can upload it to the internet. You can embed it in a course management system if this is instructional. You can embed it in a presentation. You can burn DVDs. You can stream it live. Lots of different opportunities. You'll learn how to do each of these later on in the course. So that concludes Module 1. This has been our introduction to the instructional video genre. The remaining modules in this course will explore the entire production process in a lot more detail, but I hope that these basic structures and examples that we've reviewed here will help establish a foundation of fundamental concepts that will guide us the rest of the course. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.